This video is going to be a quick tutorial in Blender on how to create a geometry node network to create paintable destruction or damage on our meshes. So what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to create a node network where if I take the vertex paint node and I paint on my mesh with the color white, it will actually do damage and reveal damage on the mesh, or kind of break parts of the mesh away. So we can actually paint damage into our geometry and have that all end up being actual geo. So it reveals this rebar or this framework below on the mesh, and we can paint all this damage. And if we don't want that damage, we can just go back to vertex paint mode, paint with the color black, and kind of undo that damage as well. And maybe a quicker way to do this would just be to turn off my modifier preview or my geometry node preview, paint all that damage away, and then turn it back on. And now it's back to its original state. So we can set up a network that allows us to do this easily in Blender using geometry nodes, and that's what we'll be taking a look at how to do in this video. To begin, we'll just create a brand new scene, and we'll delete the default cube and create a sphere. So add mesh and a UV sphere. So now that we have our sphere created, we're going to go create our geometry node setup. So we're going to go to geometry nodes at the top here, and I'll create a new geometry node graph for this object. And we'll add the geometry node modifier here to our sphere object, and we can kind of begin creating our geometry node setup. So we have our input and our output. And what we're going to do is start off with our group input here and connect a set position node. So this will set the positions of the faces or the vertices of the mesh. We're not going to set the position, we're going to actually just add an offset to them. So we're going to add an offset which will be the current direction that they're facing, and then we'll minus a little bit away from it. So we'll do like a multiply, a vector multiply, and we'll get the normals of the faces or of the vertices, so the directions that they're currently facing or angled towards, and then we'll just multiply it by maybe like a negative value, and we'll put negative 0.15, and that will just shift this object to be a bit smaller. If we connect our output now, we'll notice that the object shrinks a little bit. So that's totally fine, and now we've just shrunken our object a bit, and what we want to do is Boolean away the center of it so we can create a sphere that has some thickness, like a bit of a wall. Because right now if we look at it in wireframe mode, it's just kind of a sphere that's hollow. It doesn't actually have like thickness to it. So we want to create a bit of a wall here so there's some thickness and a hollow inside. So to do that, what we'll end up doing next is creating another set position node, which will take this new position that we have and we'll offset it by the same amount, by another negative 0.15 for a multiply here. So we'll just connect it right back up. And now if we look at that new set position, it makes it even smaller. So if we take these two set position nodes now and Boolean them away from each other, so I'm going to do that next. I'm going to create a mesh Boolean. So I'll drag out from this set position node and do a mesh Boolean. And that will minus this second set position away from this one. So it'll be minusing a bigger sphere away from a smaller one. And the result that it will give is now a sphere with some wall thickness and a hollow inside. So now we have kind of our structure of our kind of concrete that we have. We have this shape, and it actually has a wall or thickness and a hollow inside. So now that we've built this geometry node setup for this part of our graph, we're going to organize that and just group that. So I'm just going to take all these nodes here, and I can just do a right click, join in new frame, give it a name, and I'm going to call it create geo thickness. So there we go. And we'll leave that alone for now. And then we're going to make the second part of this, which is kind of the rebar or the framework on the inside of this concrete. So the next thing we'll do is, again, we'll start with our original geo, just our sphere. And we're going to do, again, a set position node. And this time we'll do the same kind of thing. We're going to do a multiply for the offset. So multiply vector. We'll use the normals again. But this time we're going to multiply it by a slightly different value, a little bit more. So negative 0.225 maybe. And what that will do is push this outer face in, so we kind of get it right in between these two kind of thickness of the walls here. So not in the empty area in the center, but kind of right in the middle of these two sections. So maybe this will do that. If I take a look at it, where is it going to end up at compared to this? It's kind of in the center. I'm just going to go with that, and we'll see what happens. We can always adjust that later anyways. But what we'll do now is we'll take this set position node, and we'll turn that mesh. So we're going to convert that mesh to curve, and then that will just change all these lines of the mesh into a curve. And then we'll take those curves and do curve back to a mesh, so curve to mesh. And then we'll use a profile curve, which will be an arc, and we'll set it to be really small, like 0.01, whoops, 0.01. And resolution, we'll keep it low so it's fast, maybe 8 sides or something, doesn't really matter. And we'll connect that to our output and see what we got. So now we have this kind of framework. So we go back to solid mode, there we go, we have our framework. So now that we have our framework below that shape, we're going to, again, take this, keep it organized, put it in a new frame, rename that frame, and just call it whatever we want to call it that makes sense. Maybe it's just our great rebar and support frame. And we'll just drag this here. So we have those two sections, our geo thickness and our rebar and support frame. And what are we going to do next? I'm just going to tidy up this graph a bit. The next thing that we're going to do is do the damage component of this. So we have that mesh with thickness. We need a way to add damage to this. So we need a kind of shape that we're going to generate that's going to be able to kind of take away or minus away from this mesh and create damage. So we'll go again all the way back to our original input. This time we're going to distribute some points on the faces of the mesh. And I can just output that. I'll pull this output node over here so we can see what we're doing. That'll distribute a bunch of points to all the faces. And what we're going to be able to do from that is take those points and instance geometry to those points. So we'll do an instance on points. What we're going to instance is maybe a UV sphere, so nothing special, just a sphere. Segments 8, rings 8, or maybe even lower, like 6, just to keep it fast. So we're not adding a ton of polygons. And radius could be pretty small. Let's see how that looks. Okay, now we got a bunch of spheres, but they're all the same size. So the next thing we want to do is add some random varying size. So what we'll do next is, after those instance on points, we'll do a scale instances. And we'll scale those instances by a random value for the scale. So I'll connect the scale to a random value. But the problem is our random value only, we'll do a random value for like X, Y, Z. And if we do that, like if we try this out, we're going to run into the issue of they all become weird shapes. So instead what I'm going to do is just do a combine X, Y, Z, and then random value, and just connect that to all 3 channels. And that way, each channel, XYZ, uses the same random value that it generates. So they stay kind of the same ratio. They don't get squished or stretched. So there we go. And maybe I'll randomize it with a maximum of a higher number. So now we get these varying randomization of circles or spheres. So it's not all the same and super consistent. And that gives us just a bit of extra breakup. And then finally, after doing this random kind of scaling, we'll realize our instances. So it turns it kind of back into static geometry. And we'll do one more set position node just to give some breakup into these shapes. So I'll do a set position, and the offset this time will be a multiply. And then we're going to multiply it by another multiply. And that's going to be multiplied by our normal, so the direction of what the faces are facing, and then a noise texture. And then this multiply here is almost just like a strength control. So we can even connect this up to a value. So what we end up with, and maybe I need to give myself a bit more room here on this network. Drag these out so we have more room to put these nodes. We can always combine these nodes and group them and stuff, but just to keep everything all visual here. We now have this value amount, so that will give us kind of some random offset. So maybe I'll just set it to something like 0.15 subtle, but a bit of breakup. You could change the scale or the wobble here of our noise texture, but that'll just give it some additional breakup. Maybe it doesn't add too much here, but if these were higher quality with more edges and stuff, it might be helpful. And that's stuff that we can always control. So now that we've done this, we've created all these shapes that we're going to minus away. All we need to do now is Boolean this away from our original mesh that we created. So what we're going to do now is, again, group all this. So all this whole new section that I made, just select it all, join a new frame, rename it, and I can just organize it as like whatever we want to call it, but just like applying damage or something. So maybe I can just say main damage or something, and that should be fine. So now we have our graphs like this, and we can maybe reorganize this just a bit. There we go. And we can Boolean now our damage away from our geo that has a thickness. So we'll create a mesh Boolean. So I'll just drag this out. Mesh Boolean. It'll be mesh 2 because we're subtracting this main damage away from mesh 1, the original geo. We'll turn self-intersection on, have the mode set to difference, and let's preview our output. And what do we get? Takes a little bit of time for it to load. There we go. We get our damaged sphere. Now that looks a little bit ugly and not too detailed, so we're going to try to improve this result. So what I'm going to do is do a subdivide on this, or a subdivision surface. For the subdivision amount, it could just be 1, but we'll connect this to a value because we're probably going to be connecting it to another subdivision surface later on as well. So this way I have a value to control it from multiple nodes. But after doing that, it already smooths this out quite a bit, and it will look a little bit better. Now, after that subdivision surface, what we're going to end up doing is, again, doing a set position node, and we're going to offset some vertices or faces again, but this time we're only going to do it for the edge, so that the edge of the damage has more breakup and more variation. So we'll do a set position. For the selection of where we're going to be changing the position of, we'll use the intersecting edges only. So the intersecting edges from our mesh Boolean. The offset amount will be, again, a multiply. and we're going to multiply our noise texture by a normal, so we'll do another multiply. And here we'll do our noise texture, and here we'll do our normal. And this will be our multiplier or strength here, so we're going to put it fairly low, 0.05, and 0.05, 0.05, and we'll see what that does now to our shape. So if we connect that up, what do we end up with? Okay, the edges get this more rigid breakup. And again, we can improve those edges a bit. We're going to add another subdivision surface to smooth it. Level, set to our value that we've already specified. View that output. What does it look like? Okay, that looks a bit smoother. And now what we can do is combine everything together, but again, I'll group this, name it, so everything's organized. So join a new frame. And maybe I'll call this like edge damage or something. So rename edge damage, there we go. So that's our network now. And we'll combine everything together. We have our resulting damage here. We just need to add the rebar on top of that. So to bring those two things together, what we're going to end up doing is adding a join geometry. So we'll create a join geometry node. And we'll join this with our rebar and support frame. Output that as our final result. And what do we end up with? There we go. We have now our damaged sphere and the rebar. But now we need to control what areas are damaged. So to do that, we're going to go all the way back here to when we start doing the damage. We scatter those points along this mesh and instance the sphere that gets booleaned away to create all this damage. We're going to change the selection of where those points get distributed to by just taking that selection of the distribute points on faces and dragging it to the empty slot of our group input. And that will link it up here in our modifier node. Now we see the selection with this number, and it could be 1 for being fully damaged, 0 for not being damaged at all. But we're going to control that with vertex painting, or with painting in our vertex channels. So to do that, we're going to go to our object here, our sphere, and we're going to go under our other options here. So if we go under, I think it's this one here, we want our color attributes, and we're going to add a new one. We're going to call it VTXC, or whatever you want to call it. I'm just calling it VTXC for vertex color, because that's essentially what it is. And it's going to be black by default, or not damaged by default. I'll click OK. Now it creates that vertex color channel, and I will connect that channel into our modifiers tab for our geometry nodes for the selection here. So that selection refers to this selection, which goes into where points can be distributed on this face, or on the faces of our sphere. And I'm going to change that. I'm going to click this button so it doesn't have a number, and I'll put in our vertex color. So now it's all connected. So if I paint on the vertices, it will use that painted section as a mask for where it can distribute points for damage. So if I go in here and I change this to vertex paint, I'm painting with white. And if I just paint on this, there we go, it starts painting our damage. And this can be a bit slow, especially if we made this more detailed. So what I would recommend is disable our geometry nodes view, do your painting, paint where you want the damage to be, and then turn it back on, and you'll see the end result. And there we go, we have our damaged sphere now that we can paint on. And if you don't want that damage, just go back to our vertex mode and paint with the color black, and then that will paint away our damage. And again, it gets a little bit slow, especially in painting away the damage. So I could just disable this, preview, paint everything dark, and then turn it back on. And assuming you've painted all those values totally dark, I might have to put my strength up pretty high here just to make sure I'm not missing any values. But that will paint everything away, as you can see. There we go. So very easy to add damage and remove damage. Now you can improve this a lot, the look of it, the detail of it, perhaps even the speed and functionality of it, but at least this gives a good starting point with geometry nodes to kind of get creative and make all kinds of networks that might be useful. So I'll leave it there, but if you found this video useful, please like, subscribe, and again, if you're part of the Patreon, you'll be able to find a PDF that covers all the steps that we went over in this video for reference and just for review.